Welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Christopher Stahl. I recently crossed paths with him last year in Lisbon, and we were actually on a ferry crossing the Tejo River, and we started talking about art and provenance. How do we think about it from like a curation standpoint? Yeah, why don't we just see where this conversation leads us?
Just a little bit of my own background. I'm trained actually as a historiographer, as a performance historiographer, looking at 19th century popular performance and visual media culture. So technically, I really looked at stage magic.
Okay.
People like Houdini, the ways in which wonder presented it as sort of popular entertainment in the like 1880s to about 1920s. I was also a clinical associate professor of composition and rhetoric at New York University, working with people across disciplines, mostly with art students and new media students, working on writing projects and sort of getting clarity and ideas. Currently, I'm living in Portland, Oregon, and working on an MLIS, Master of Library and Information Science at the University of Washington's Information School. The work I'm tending to focus on is digital humanities, archiving, and digital preservation.
Wow.
Thinking through like how things get preserved and then organized both in physical form and then in digital form as well. Though, I mean, I've been doing some classes in born digital media, so.
In foreign digital media?
Born digital media versus like, say, work that's been transformed from one format to another. So like work that's born digital would be things that were, sort of like taken with a cell phone versus something that's taken with a camera that's been then converted to a streaming format and then preserved. So born digital refers to stuff that actually doesn't need that kind of transformation to be archived or arranged or described.
Got it. I think it's funny that we put like a human term onto these digital files, that it's birthed, that it comes out of something.
That is true. There's often like this kind of biological mapping onto processes that have nothing to do with the body.
A lot of how I got started with this was an accidental VJ. We have mutual friends who've had art parties, and I would just put stuff on the screen for a half hour and mix a lot of things that vaguely resembled the theme. And that kind of got me into thinking, how do I do this where I don't have to edit this? And that's where years ago I thought AI is just really going to do this. So let me just write a system and outline the parameters of what AI would do. And it also mirrored a lot of my ad tech days because I worked in programmatic advertising, digital media. It's a really nerdy way to say when you're seeing content online, it's being customized for you because there's some capitalistic incentive. And so when I look at this, I think, how do we take media, how do we edit it into the most interesting pieces or try out a few combinations and produce something new, but also while linking back to the original source. And that's where we keep talking about what I would say attribution, you'd probably say provenance, or on a more spiritual level, maybe lineage.
Provenance has a couple of particular meanings. It's actually about chains of custody and ownership. Provenance is a way to guarantee you can track who has had it from its moment of creation to the moment of its possession in your hands or on your screen. Provenance is actually just to say like, okay, so we have this, Rembrandt from the Rijksmuseum. So on a provenantial level, yes, we've got the metadata that says, okay, this is the Rijksmuseum's copy and it was uploaded and recorded and has this many, it's in this format. So you can talk about provenance of the digital object, which is to say, when was it recorded? When was it uploaded? Is it in a lossy or non-lossy format? Modern archiving is like a post-French Revolution thing because the royal governments of Lisbon, Paris would take the state archives and mix them up into categories that they thought reflected them. And what the problem was, it would dehistoricize objects and it would make them kind of just unmoored from any meaning except for that which was presented on them by the royals. After the revolution, various statesmen were really trying to set up some rules about like how you make sure that the thing is the thing. We have this document. How do we really know that this document is a bill from Prince Henry the Navigator's baptism in the Port City archives? Like how do we know that? So we can think of provenance in two ways. We can think of the provenance of the physical object in parts where there are physical objects. So we can say like, okay, this painting was painted by so-and-so. It was gifted to this family and then to this family and then to this family and then to this museum. And we can track those chains of custody because we have records that do that, digital or physical.
This sounds very blockchain, by the way.
And then you have the provenance of the digital object, which is to say, okay, so let's say we took this painting and we've done like a really high quality TIFF of it, so that we can have it in our storage because, God help us, there's a fire. So we no longer have a physical object, but we have a digital object. How do we know that the digital object is the digital object of that physical object? So you've got the provenance of the physical object, which is, recorded and sort of checked. And then when it becomes digital, it gets like an extra layer of provenance onto it. It was recorded and uploaded at such and such a time. It has so many bytes to it. So we can keep checking that to make sure that one, nothing's deteriorated, and two, that it is the thing that was uploaded on such and such a date at such and such a time. So now there's a sort of an extra layer that the digital object has a kind of a provenanceal marker to it. If you're going to have something in TIFF format, which is a relatively non-lossy format, that takes a lot of space. So oftentimes you convert it to something like a JPEG, which interprets blank space, right? JPEGs are kind of like a blurry snapshot of the thing. You may not notice the blurriness because it may not make a difference to our eye when it gets lossier and lossier and lossier. You might have like provenance on the TIFF, and then you have a JPEG version which circulates. Provenance is actually part of respect this falls, which is part of this archival theory, which is to say that in order to have the thing be the thing, respect the funds means respect the fund, respect the
Well, the source.
a fund is respect the source. So respect where it came from. So you if you have like a box of papers, provenance would be where to come from. And then the other part of respect the fonts would be original order, which is to say, how is it arranged? Did we keep that arrangement or did we rearrange it in a way that we think is better? Back to that earlier story, because the European royals were always ripping things out of context and just placing them together in ways they thought fit, original order was gone, which is to say, how did this person in the 13th century arrange it? Why was that meaningful? And do we want to keep that arrangement? Is it in an order that is reflective of us, or is it an order that's reflective of the creator?
How does this happen in a world where we're creating exponentially more media in all these formats and there's just a lot of garbage there? Like, I'm thinking even how many good photos were on our old Nokia cell phones that were probably hilarious, but they're just in a dump somewhere. It's like, how do we get that stuff out? Or how do when we take so many photos on our phone, it just gets lost in the mix and it's less precious?
The basic concept is embrace the archival sliver. So Trevor Owens is a digital preservation specialist, and you might want to check out his book, The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation. The archival sliver is a concept that comes about from archivists trying to deal with apartheid South Africa because the government would be destroying records or changing records. And so we're only going to capture a sliver of what happened. Trevor Owens would say something along the lines of, well, what we're dealing with really is a sliver of a sliver. When we're dealing with the digital, we will never capture everything. And we've got to grab that small slice that we can and preserve it.
I think that's interesting too, because now there's the dead internet theory, and we have this world where we thought if a web page was up in the year 1998 or in 2010, that was just going to be there forever. And now you just see sites are taken down. And we do have archive.org or like the Wayback Machine, and some people that do crawl the internet. I'm sure some of the major telecommunications companies or tech platforms, and they train on it and they sort of create new technology. But we're in this world where there is this retro nostalgia of saying, remember when the internet was fun? Remember when people were nice and creative and quirky and we sort of supported each other versus this less than ideal, more polarized. That's the easiest and nicest way I'm going to say that. We assumed that was going to be there and now it's not. And we want to look back and then hopefully someone's preserving some slivers of something.
Digital humanities is an attempt to work at scale with cultural objects. So, for instance, instead of looking at Balzac, just one book by Balzac, you look at everything that's been published in France between the 1860s and the 1880s. You go to the digital objects and then you start looking for things within that. So digital humanities is less about the kind of I am the scholar looking at the book. And it's more like I am the scholar looking at about 700 books at once using AI, using algorithms, using these different technologies. And we're trying to see what scale can give us. A lot of the platforms that are being created for digital humanities emphasize web stability. If you're looking at a piece of archiving or display software, you don't want to have like these cute little bells and whistles that aren't going to be supported by the next browser. So you want things that are kind of looking a little retro. Collection Builder is one of the platforms I was looking at that allows you to do static web exhibitions with rich metadata that also have some geolocation capability and timeline capability. So a lot of these platforms that are created within the digital humanities are static or have static web capabilities because the technology changes in like 3 years. Like, oh, look, this plugin's no longer supported. So suddenly my entire project dies.
Yeah, Flash.
Right. And, Flash had its own problems, but the problem or the pleasure of some of these things is they look really old school. You've got things that look really kind of 2008, 2009 aesthetics versus some kind of like really flashy AI-based interaction, but they last. Do you know things like Collection Builder?
No, I don't. Because I tend to work with time-based media and porting it over into a level of interactivity. So it's more like audio and video, and are they playing synchronously or asynchronously? And then what are the other options? And giving people the controls to say, like, turn this layer on, turn this layer off, play it on this device, play it on this device. So it's more like, how do we port over older things into the new environment? Because that seems like the most value that's from there. And then also thinking about when people make a lot of things now, it does have the potential to have this interactivity or like multi-layeredness built in. And we're saying, how do we build the right players for it? How do we build the experiences or let other people create their own experiences, really? And one thing I noticed is, especially with certain AI services that do this editing, like let's say we were putting some subtitles here in this conversation, it's created in software and then it usually gets flattened and then shipped out to the regular platform. But the way I look at it is saying, how do you take those? Like there's right now 2 video feeds and audio feed.
Right.
We're speaking in American English right now, and we don't have any background music. But how do we like have it where it gets shipped out, where the layers are preserved? And then we could add in background music if we wanted. If we could make this white background have some sort of movement, which I did in my last podcast episode, things like that you want to give people control on and off. So yeah, I tend to work with like really old stuff and like stuff that's coming out right now.
So how do you make it not fragile?
What would you define as fragile?
One upgrade of a certain piece of software or the lack of support for a certain platform element, if that goes away, then it's like a Jenga tower. Like, how many pieces can you take away and the tower still stands if this is the digital object? To me, like one of the sort of issues that you might run into is once you start overlaying a lot of technology onto something, you have large amounts of dependencies. If one falls apart, is that going to knock on to another one? When you start working with all these multiple channel streams, what's going to stop it from tangling? And if someone doesn't have the right device to play it, or does it follow certain degrees of accessibility? Is that even important to you to have that degree of accessibility? You talk about having subtitles or the translations, but how accessible is that? So if we pivot the screen, will we lay out differently in a way that is still viable?
Yeah. Well, one thing is in terms of accessibility, I do see an opportunity, especially in certain regions like the European Union. They like it when you generally translate things into 27 languages or so that are the official languages. And obviously AI can do that. The question is, should AI do that in real time, or should we wait for it to process, or should every piece of content be translated? And that's something else to think about. Also, on a lot of TV here, because of broadcasting requirements, there is somebody speaking sign language in the corner of the screen, but that's a flat broadcast on television. So the way I look at it is, have that digital asset, let it be an option, and just somebody who needs that will have that as their default to see it, where someone who doesn't need it won't have that spot taken up with that content unless they want to, and they really could turn it on. I think of it more like on a protocol infrastructure layer, saying we have these raw assets, we have these instructions for how it can run as a default and how it can adapt. Actually, I've been doing some abstract vibe coding to look at how we can have things like AI interpret, observe what the environment is, and change the layouts, and saying, how do we rewrite the initial code knowing that that's going to happen in the future? And I got to say, with vibe coding, a lot of it just ends up not being usable, but it does help you think about the structure. And I have a lot more appreciation for people who are engineers, architects in a digital domain, because I'm like, wow, there's so many ways to look at this to build that Jenga tower that won't fall. But you were also saying in terms of configuration layout, that is something that I do think about, where like right now I'm looking on my screen, I'm on the bottom, you're on the top, we have different camera sizes. And if I were editing it in, let's say, a video editing software program, I would probably put us side by side and do all these things. I know someone who watches videos of Dungeons and Dragons campaigns where they show the actors and they show the board,
Right.
and there might be some text, and it's just laid out for Twitch or just however it should be. And the person told me, I want to hit a button and just see it laid out. I don't care about the people's faces. I want to see the board. I want to see the stats, or maybe I do in a certain part want to see the faces jump up. So if we look at these as separate streams or parameters, I think we're getting really close to a future where you could just hit a button and see things just change in real time. I would also argue,
Right.
do we need to overprocess AI and waste that much electricity and water to do this for every single possibility for everything? Like, do we really need a multiverse for every piece of media? Probably not, but I do think that we should have some easy ways to have options, and we don't necessarily need to like pre-render all this stuff.
So let's say the Brooklyn Museum adopts your platform. They would have their own content, which they would create. They might have programs or podcasts or, a dance company coming in and performing in the lobby or whatever. They store and control the media. And then someone can come and have a certain degree of manipulatability of that content, which they can then project onward.
A lot of what we are enabling is a legal copyright system and a way to allow the remixing happening where everyone can be acknowledged and rewarded for it. We're building two things at the same time that are interrelated. So one is this social TV app, which looks like TV from the 90s. You hit channel up, channel down, except your phone is a remote control. It's casting a series of content. And if you want to get deeper into it, it is a video layer, audio layers. In the early phases in the prototypes, it's like a web page with just the information about it. In the future, it's more of like a self-generated attribution page. So that's not that far from what exists right now. But underneath it is this infrastructure saying, okay, we're taking this media, we're giving it commands, it's playing here, but it could play in other environments and ecosystems. So when it's a social TV app, it's much easier to just say, let's host it on more generic web services. Let's put it where the engineers want to put it so they know it's going to work. And I do think that the long-term solution is more about a decentralized ecosystem where it's saying, why don't we self-host? Why don't we put it on a local server? Why don't we have it shared on a net of people in a way that's somewhat blockchain-like, but I would say it's IPFS, like the interplanetary file system. In this case, it's saying, I want to have this media in this pristine form, or I'm going to have the thing that's kind of good enough and works in this situation.
So you might have, like, let's say, Jane Smith as a user of Ambistream. So Jane Smith might be streaming and remixing content from, say, the Brooklyn Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a Dodgers game, so she's kind of mixing things together. Is she able to store this, and where would she store it? Or is it sort of like, I'm live DJing and people can look at my channel, or if I have a particular mix, can I store this show that people can access? Or is it more just like people want to watch Jane Smith do her thing? Like, we want to watch what Jane Smith is watching, and we want to watch how Jane Smith is watching.
All of the above. What we're working on is creative partnerships, and we're beta testing that now. We are looking for cultural institutions, and we're in conversations. Like, for example, we know some people that create a lot of AI art, and they say, "Look, it would be great to showcase it on your platform. Have it, like let's experiment with this." We're looking at that versus somebody saying, "Hey, I'm a serious video artist, and I don't want to be in a channel next to cat videos. I want to have a channel next to other artists of my tier or better, and I show in galleries." And so part of it is, what does the creator want to be featured as, and what does the user want to remix from? Part of it is saying, we assume that most people will be just general consumers. This is like things that we look out and test and look at metrics where they say, okay, these channels are pre-aggregated. I'm clicking through them. I'm liking this one. I'm not liking this one. But then they could add it to their feed. So it's almost like the MySpace top 8, like that. Back in the day, you had your top 8 friends, and if you change your friend, you get a phone call, like, "Hey, why did you take me out of your top 8?" It's like one of those. So it's like false scarcity to say, like, we have this channel, there's only 13 channels, like, let's just watch those. But in real life, you're going to look at what someone else has created. So we think that there'll be curators who will just take other people's content and mix them. And so a lot of it is saying, no one's going to watch a 10-minute video. Let's do 90-second clips. And so that's generally based on like what I've done as testing. So it is like a video playlist. I kind of say it's like a horizontal playlist. It's not like a YouTube playlist where it's vertical. or like an audio playlist that's vertical. It's more like an EPG, like a electronic programming guide, which is like when you're on your cable box and you see the TV shows, you're putting them side by side saying play this, then this, then this. And that's generally the earlier use cases that we're going to do. As we move on in the future, we say, okay, well, what happens when they get to the end of that channel? A lot of times what I would do at parties and events is it loops back to the beginning, because I notice that people sometimes they want to go deeper. They want to learn more about it. So we put a QR code, they scan it, they find out all the provenance information that they could find about it, or they just might want to watch the full video at that point. But in general, when we loop videos, it makes people feel this sense of comfort because they're not missing it again. And it kind of creates that moment of when you were a kid and you had to be home by a certain time to watch that TV show you wanted to watch. There's a little bit of like stress and attention happening there. I like the idea of having that in a false sense, but also letting them just go get a video on demand if they want to. I'm trying to look at other experiences that aren't the grid menu, up, down, left, right, typing. We could totally emulate that. And we actually do have kind of like a hybrid library version of it in the back end. That is one thing. And then part of it is saying, well, this person's a good curator. I want them on my feed. I want them to be channel 8. I want to watch what they're creating. And then we kind of see that probably like a tier of like 15 to 20% will be these curators, remixers, getting into it and wanting to share it. And then we probably say that a smaller percentage, maybe around 5%, is what we anticipate will be original creators, people putting content on. And that is a combination of high-end art pieces, but it could also be dance video that you filmed in the basement with your friends and you only want your family to see. So a lot of that's like, how do you limit the privacy and publicity of things? Because we're kind of entering into a new period of social where broadcasting everything online all the time is not cool. It's actually kind of dangerous. It doesn't make you feel good. So it's about like, what is this WhatsApp chat version of a shared media channel experience?
In library science, we talk about the bibliographic objects. And so this makes me start to think about like, how does this work become findable and in library science terms, collocatable? I keep thinking about like how one sort of puts metadata to the work.
Yeah.
So to make it sort of searchable, findable, discoverability. That's the term you're using.
We have plans, and one of the things we're fundraising for is to be able to build these AI content producer agents. In 2019, I was like, I can't do this on my own. And I did hire students to actually edit and cut videos, and it's nice to see like how someone else can curate and edit. And my style's a little bit rough, but that's fine. And it works for what I'm doing for these events. And, I do events regularly. But looking at this and saying, how do we tag the metadata? How do we look at this? There is visual meta tagging that's happening automatically through all the major services. They offer a version of that. Like Azure, Microsoft, it's almost like you have to turn it off if you don't want them to over index things. But what we're trying to look for are other parameters that are a little softer. So saying, okay, maybe someone wants a pink channel. Pretty obvious that will be tagged there. But do you want a certain mood or a feeling? That is one thing that is getting easier every year with AI capabilities. It just becomes a matter of computing costs. One of the things we do have to think about is, do we want this to be running through an API, going through a third-party service that we have to pay to do that? Or do we want to have our own servers with more open source models and it's tagging it and storing it locally? And then maybe, like there's a whole bunch of different ways to do that. But in general, that is changing every 3 months. It's like evolving quickly.
Yeah, it's starting to get me to think about a pink channel. So in library science terms, the thesaurus is used to reduce ambiguity about what we mean by something. How do we resolve that to a term that's going to be recognized by the system? A thesaurus in information terms is about taking all of these different terms and saying, well, within the system, it's referred to as X. You may talk about this in these terms, but we have like a program or a document. It makes me think about like something like pink, what would that be? Like, would the AI kind of look at all the people who have used pink as a category that they're trying to create and say like, when the users say pink, they really mean hip hop videos and classical music by Shostakovich, whatever. And the artist pink, things that are sort of like obvious, but also things that users have kind of tagged as being pink.
Yeah, so I can tell you just by editing videos and making them pink in the past and running them through filters. So sometimes you find a subject matter that is naturally pink, and that's cool. And then you realize when you start working with any color, like, well, there's fuchsia pink and there's light red pink, which is not the same thing, and they have a different feeling. And, fuchsia feels more synthetic because it's actually not a real color. whereas light red can feel a little more sophisticated and don't always have that many choices of content that is available. I think in the future that will be pretty much solved. Like we're going to have real or synthetically created AI generated content that we can have for that, which really changes the game for this. So one of the things we look at is if you have a piece of media, like let's say the original, and then you have these chunks that you want to use, and then you want to turn it pink, what is the method or process to take that, to run it through a third party, to make it that color, and then bring it back in the mix? And so what we generally do is keep them as separate chunks, but we play them together. Or the other option would be that you make a larger, let's say an hour-long video that was just like pre-rendered. Just depends what environment you're playing for.
I'm thinking more like someone says pink and the algorithm goes, on the one hand, this carnation. On the other hand, early period Miley Cyrus. So in other words, pink becomes less about like the color and more about a vibe.
It's funny because I don't think of Miley Cyrus and pink as being the association.
Well, just as an example,
Like a pop star pink, let's say.
Is pink cute? Is pink dangerous? Is pink
sensitive?
It's a flower actually from the Eastern Mediterranean region that in the 17th century, people got really excited over. A lot of colors take their name from flowers, but to what degree does the algorithm pick up on pink as a vibe, not just a color? And to what degree does the algorithm rely on users who may folksonomically tag something as pink?
It depends. That's like the really easy answer to say there. But so when people right now are prompting with AI, there's actually a lot of like undercover prompting happening to make a better response when people want to create images, because the services know they want better videos, they want better images or music, and they're not asking it well, but they know how to ask in the system. So sometimes you don't see that. I think in general, I'm all about like, let's open it up. Let's see what happened in that middle process. If we really want to dissect one prompt to the result, like we should be able to open that up and see the decision-making process. Also just to make sure like the robots don't kill us. So the other thing is I come from the big data industry and advertising, and it's kind of an offshoot of fintech. And we also call it the surveillance economy. So it's like in the worst way, that's like the shadow form of this. It's saying like, we're looking at you, we're figuring out what your likely intention is so we can show you this, so we can, increase sales by a micro percentage. And that also happens with AI. It happens with content, just depending on what the motives are of the people behind the system. We want them to click like, we want them to zone out, stare at the screen and be happy, or, share it with their friends, whatever the motivations are. The way I look at it is that we all do have personal digital profiles with many different companies. And a lot of that is already assumed upon us. Could be geographic, and it could be a lot of safe data, right? Like I don't care if they know my region and where I am in terms of like the city, but maybe they don't need to know the block or the street. So I think a lot of it is about having a new tier of users that want to actually play with these dials and say, look at me from the city I'm in, look at me from the neighborhood I'm in, and treat me differently based on that. Like, my history, or maybe you shouldn't know my history. It's like, how do we give people those levers and controls and be active in the process? Again, probably most people aren't going to care. People just want easy things. They want the lowest hanging fruit or easy convenience. But I do think that there are kind of fun ways where people can get involved with this. And I think it's a really good indicator to see that people are playing so much with prompt engineering and customizing, because when we do work with AI, we are creating our own algorithms in a way. Give me this answer, but give it to me this way. Here's an example of what I like. Take some elements of that, but I want you to add this spin on it. And so that is real-time remixing and creating algorithms. And I think that there is a lot of stuff happening automatically in the background. And I'm all about like, let's play with that. Let's open that up. And I want to hang out with the nerds who want to do that kind of stuff. And I'm okay if someone hits pink and it's just whatever it decided that they have and they didn't get involved with the process. But I like the idea of somebody going for, what was your extreme example of pink?
Or early Miley Cyrus videos, bubblegum rock.
We're getting back to this mode of like Winamp. Did you ever play with Winamp where you'd customize your skins and...
Oh, not for a long time. Well, I mean, so it feels like in many ways you're working on certain kinds of like low-tech nostalgia, evoking these old technologies to do new things. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, you're trying to hit a sweet spot between versus these kinds of retro comforts.
I think it's just because of me and like what I'm looking for, maybe. And I do think when people create companies or works of art or film or things, it usually does end up being a reflection of the people behind it. Maybe that's why. Maybe that's not what the world wants. Part of this is just experimenting and seeing. But in general, we do see that a lot of websites are all looking the same, or everyone's house is like that millennial gray color. And I think that there are cycles and there will be this kind of like, let's get sloppy and messy phase. And we are reaching a new period of the internet where we're going to have more bots than human users, and we're going to have more AI generated content than human generated content, and it's going to eclipse it. And it might be awful. Like we might need to like sub curate like a non garbage area of the internet, or just go like back in time with certain things in terms of how we format it. So I think that we're about to see a bunch of leaps. I mean, we already have in the past couple of years, but it's going to be more outwardly visible in the next few years. And it's like, how do you have a sense of control in constant creation and chaos? I think part of it is just giving you tools and seeing which ones stick.
In a way, like there's a kind of a youth culture vibe. Youth culture vibe is she's so old. You know, those whippersnappers with their raves and their Molly and it's more like a person who is a digital creative who could see this as a tool for these kinds of manipulatable sort of like vibe hangouts, people who work at bars, whatever, kind of makes the process of DJing or VJing like very easy to kind of curate these kinds of vibey, atmospheres.
The host, someone that's curating it or they're sharing it. Also, because of the way we look at this as being multiple layers, the controls are in your hands and the visuals are going on this screen, and maybe your little smart tablet here is telling you the information about it. And so part of this is, again, we were talking about the customization. How does it adapt to the room that you're in, or what are your settings? You could just say, don't do that. We did do some research on this, and we noticed if you were going to have like a house party and you had music, you could just as easily put video on. And that usually is something that would want someone to get more into this in terms of the curation. We call it social TV because it's part streaming TV, part social media. And a lot of it is like, sometimes you just want to go down a feed and discover stuff and not think too hard. And looking at this, it's not really like a podcast where you're like really listening or you're not binge watching and focused. Sometimes it's more like those moments in between. That's not main character energy. I wanted to ask, and you can't have a podcast without talking about AI. So we had the old digital classic analog art. Now we have this world where there's this exponential scale of content created with AI. And I think there'll probably be certain levels of thoughtlessness and thoughtfulness. Apparently there are guardrails for like a well-trodden path for how you track provenance, attribution, cultural, contextual relativity. And then we have this world where digital environments are becoming exponential because of AI. So does this method change? Do we sort of give different value to AI versus human created? Or how do we figure out what to sort through and pick the slivers of slivers?
I reflect back to you a couple of things that I heard within what you were asking. One of them might be the question of how we weight an algorithmic creation versus a human-made creation, how we put value to it, functioning as aesthetic value, functioning as cultural value, functioning as monetary value. And those three sometimes align and sometimes they don't.
It's a great parameter. And I would also say, what about the human need cost? Like somebody created that work and they need to pay the bills and eat food that night. So like, how do we weigh that? And then with algorithms or AI created systems, I would say computational costs, environmental factors, externalized costs. There's a whole bunch of things to measure from this. And I would actually say my perspective at this moment in time, I guess we're recording a podcast and putting a moment in time. I would say that it's more about observing those and looking at those parameters and then figuring out how that actually gets balanced based on that. So it's more about the curiosity and seeing how that evolves.
I mean, there are similar ideas of taking snapshots of things and extrapolating based on algorithms that are dealing with certain kinds of probabilities about what should be in the next pixel versus what should be in the next word. On the one hand, I'm seeing people get very, very excited by AI as a new toy, and like, who doesn't want to look like a Labubu doll? On the other hand, there's people who are playing with it as augmentation. My cousin, who teaches film and video production at a public high school in North Carolina, has been doing a lot with AI with family photographs. He's actually been animating them into films.
Nice.
He's been taking pictures of our great aunt who passed away 15 years ago. and sort of animating them, these kind of micro movies with my aunt doing things she never probably did in the moment. Super fascinating and super Harry Potter creepy. Like, oh, so that's where we are now, is we've looked at those films, those living pictures in the films, and that's what we're doing now. How interesting. I guess that's like Star Trek. The communicator became the cell phone.
It's a good use of AI, by the way. There's connection, there's nostalgia, there's historical interest. Like, you might show it to your family, the kids might be interested to learn more about the times, but your cousin is putting your great aunt in a situation that she probably wasn't doing at the time. Like, you would probably be the one to say she would have a different brand of iron because they didn't have that in that time period. So you should change it to this. And that should be marked up in the notes, right? There should be a file to say, this is okay. This is totally AI. We totally made this up. This did not exist back then. And by the way, this cousin said that this iron should be different than what would be there. And then just leave it at that. Or you could eventually generate a version with the correct accessories or things like that.
But AI is super, super limited in terms of the things it can do. I mean, in the seminar I took, we met with some innovation specialists at the Library of Congress, and you could not use commercial AI within the Library of Congress for rights protection. All AI tools had to be developed in-house. So you couldn't use ChatGPT because suddenly feeding these books, you've got intellectual property rights, you've got copyright to deal with. Once things go in, they don't come out. Versus AI, what you put in stays in there and becomes an ever-evolving part of this algorithm. The second thing is, AI is not particularly efficient at doing the things we think it will do.
You're suggesting, correct me if I'm wrong, that people take time out to record the context, like add additional commentary or anything to just sort of help in the long run, because a piece can lose all of its meaning if it's just created and left somewhere. But it is that act of like putting it in the web in context of everything else in society that gives it a little more value. And it's up to the creators or other people who take an interest in it to do that.
Right. I mean, this is why a lot of large language models are always going to have like human training. A lot of the large photo archives that are used on the basis for AI algorithms contain bias, racial, gender, and class bias, and that those biases become encoded into the algorithm and have to be trained out of the algorithms. Part of the thing is left to its own devices, those biases become metastasized into the system. The human element that needs to come in and make sure the work is the work, and make sure that it's accurate or true or free from bias or free from enough bias, or that the bias is noted. The human also has to be somewhere in the equation, and possibly in multiple places, that the algorithm can do what the algorithm does, which is, in a sense,
they use that term human in the loop. People worry, what are jobs going to be like in the future if a lot of creative class or what was traditionally called white collar work is handled by computers and algorithms at some point? And it does sound like that human contextual input is what will be valuable for the next few decades. So like someone maybe with your degree is more adept at having that knowledge and going there. And that might be what the next generation is. Like, that might be a big career path in the future.
In an ideal world, that seems like an area of potential that seems really interesting, is training people to ask better questions, training people to ask large language models to do something in a better way or in an interesting way. There's labor saving that can go to that. There's certain kinds of creative noodling that can happen as a result of that. But ultimately, I think what seems important and interesting is this kind of need to find the human within it, within the AI structure. The possibility of finding these places where the human must be present, and the human innovation and artistry and creativity has to guide it, helping people become more digital literate, more technologically literate, more sort of like algorithmically literate. And that seems kind of an exciting sort of moment. It was like finding where the human fits within burgeoning AI scape, so that you're not like a mindless consumer of stuff. I mean, you can like shove as much AI slop down your throat or in your eyes or through your ears as you want. But how do you become a better consumer? Literacy is about learning to navigate these resources better rather than having them kind of control you in a certain way. Knowing enough to not be swayed by what you're seeing. So I'll end with a story of something called the Mechanical Turk. So the Mechanical Turk, it was the thing of, I think it was Amazon hiring a bunch of people to do like coding and metadata and data set training for images, for objects. And it's based on this mechanical chess player from the 18th century. It's a magic trick, actually.
Yeah, it's a guy in a box.
It's a guy in a box, but it's made to look like high-end robotics at the time, high-end automation, like clockwork automation. So the thing about the Mechanical Turk, yes, it's a guy in a box. The Turk was created to be a mechanical chess player. It was a table, a cabinet table with a chessboard on top. And the back half of it was a Turkish man in a turban. And you'd move a chess piece to a new place and usually beat you. And to show that it was purely mechanical, you could open the cabinet and you'd see the clockwork like doing its thing. And you could see through it to the other side. So no one was in there. But of course, there was usually, a very small person hidden within the cabinetry to move the thing around. And so this becomes the metaphor, I think, for thinking about AI as, where's the human within the machine? We're presented with the Mechanical Turk again, like we're marvel at it, let it beat you at chess. And really it's, there's always this kind of like the human is in the machine doing the thing, but we're led to sort of like believe that it's this mechanical marvel. And so part of what we want to do is with digital literacy is figure out where the human is within this.
The analogy really, to me, that stands out is opening up the sort of doors and seeing the gears, which we can basically do now on our social networks and on our large language model platforms. But there is a lot of, why was it coded that way? Why did they want to do that? What was the motivation there? And you can regulate that to an extent, but you can't fully, because technology does evolve faster in a digital sense rather than like laws or business practices. In general, it is providing tools for that curiosity and that critical thinking for the people who want it.
The gears, by the way, are misdirection, which is what's key on it. The Turk is insanely clever in its construction, but it's not clever in the way that it presents itself as clever, right? You open it up and people are like, oh, isn't science wonderful? Oh, the marvels of technology. But really that's misdirection. And the marvel of the Turk is its ability to create a cabinet that can house a human and fool you and create this kind of simulacrum of humanity. And that's the kind of the dazzle of it. The real dazzle is elsewhere if we know where to look for it.
Where's the dazzle now?
Where's the dazzle? Where in AI is the dazzle? That would be a good question to ask.
Okay, you know what? I'm okay with ending on a question and just kind of leaving up. Where is the real dazzle?
Where's the real dazzle? Where are the dazzle dancers? Where are they now?
On that note, with the dazzle, Christopher Stahl, thank you so much for coming on the Ambistream Media Future podcast. And we talked a lot about the past and the future. We ended on a good note.
Excellent. Good to see you again. And thank you for having me.